The night they arrested our killer, the snow fell upward. At least, that is how it looked from my porch in Willow Point, Wisconsin, as the wind tore white powder off the frozen lake and flung it back into the dark like a film running in reverse. I was an old man by then, a retired sheriff with bad knees and worse memories, and I had convinced myself that 1984 was finally done with me. Then the phone rang, the way it always does in these stories, and a young detective with a tight voice said my name in a way that made my skin remember the taste of cold metal and diesel exhaust. He said they had made an arrest in the Carson girl case, and for a second, I honestly thought he had the wrong number, because in my mind, that case was as dead and distant as the girl herself. You need to understand something before we go any further. People around here built their lives on the idea that whatever evil rolled through our part of Wisconsin in the winter of 1984 had been a stranger's shadow, a passing storm that left and never came back. We had church potlucks and high school football and ice shanties out on the lake, and we told ourselves that the horror that took Emily Carson was an exception, a fluke, a broken line in an otherwise straight story. We taught our kids to lock their doors. We kept a night light burning in the hallway, and after a few years, most folks decided that was enough penance and went back to sleeping through the night. I never quite managed that trick, but I learned to fake it, and in a small town, faking peace is almost as good as having it. If you are sitting somewhere warm right now, maybe with a grandchild asleep in the next room, let me give you a thought that will not let you get too comfortable. The worst monsters in your life are almost never the strangers your mother warned you about. The worst ones wave to you from the church parking lot, lend you a snowblower when the drift gets too high, and ask after your health at the grocery store. For 40 years, we told ourselves that whoever took Emily was long gone, dead in a ditch or rotting in some distant prison under another name. When that young detective whispered the suspect's identity into my ear, I felt something inside me tilt, the way a house shifts when the frost finally gets to its foundation. It was not a drifter, not a nameless beast out of the dark. It was one of ours. Before I tell you who, I need to take you back to the beginning, because if you do not feel the cold the way we felt it that winter, you will not understand why the arrest hit us like it did. 1984 in Willow Point was the kind of winter that makes men talk to God whether they believe in him or not. The snow came early and did not leave, a thick crust over the fields that turned every sound into something distant and muffled, as if the whole world had been wrapped in cotton. I was in my second term as county sheriff then, still young enough to think that a badge and a clean pair of boots could hold the line against whatever ugliness the world might send our way. My daughter was just starting high school. My wife still called me kid when she wanted something, and the most pressing complaint on my desk that December was a neighbor feud about a snowblower borrowed and not returned. We did not yet know that just outside the circle of our porch lights, something patient and hungry was already watching. There were signs, if you look back with the kind of hindsight that feels a little like cruelty. Street lights that flickered and died along County Road K the week before Emily disappeared, leaving a stretch of asphalt that felt more like a tunnel than a road. Dogs that would not cross the old bridge after dusk, planting their paws and whining at the dark as if they heard a sound we were too deaf or too proud to notice. A strange humming in the police radio on certain nights, a low, steady vibration under the usual static that would make the hair on my arms stand up even when the room was warm. We wrote it all off as bad wiring and winter moods and the usual weirdness that comes when the days get too short and the nights too long. You can live through a lot of unexplained things if you are determined enough to call them coincidences. The night Emily vanished, the sky over Willow Point was so clear it felt hollow. You could see every star, hard and sharp as broken glass, and the northern lights were smeared along the horizon in a thin, sickly green band that never quite made it into the pretty postcards. I remember that because I was sitting in the cruiser at the edge of Highway 17, drinking coffee that tasted like burned cardboard and filling out a report about a fender bender, when the lights flickered in the rearview mirror. For a heartbeat or two, the entire world went dark. No street lamps, no farmhouse windows, just the reflection of my own face in the glass, and that ugly green glow on the horizon. Then everything snapped back on, brighter than before, like someone had unplugged us and plugged us in again. At the time, I swore under my breath, smacked the dash, and made a note to yell at the county engineer about the grid. Only later did I learn that somewhere between that blackout and the moment the lights returned, a teenage girl named Emily Carson stepped out of a friend's front yard to walk the short distance home and simply never arrived. The call did not come in as a scream. In the movies, it is always hysterical, a mother weeping into the receiver or a father shouting threats at the operator. In reality, panic has a quieter, heavier sound, like water filling a basement. It was 20 minutes past 10 when the dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio, sounding thin and tinny against the low-frequency hum that had not quite left the air since the lights flickered. She told me that Helen Carson was on the line, that Emily was supposed to be home from the library by 9:30, and that the phone at the library was just ringing and ringing in an empty room. I remember looking at the digital clock on my dashboard, the red numbers burning into the dark cabin, and feeling a sudden irrational annoyance. Teenagers were late. They lost track of time. They stopped to talk to boys. They took the long way home to smoke a cigarette where the neighbors wouldn't see. I wanted it to be that. I wanted it to be simple rebellion, not the opening line of a tragedy that would haunt my town for 40 years. I drove the route Emily would have walked, rolling slow with the window down despite the freezing air, letting the cold sting my eyes so I would not miss a shadow or a movement in the snowbanks. The silence of Willow Point that night was absolute. Usually, you would hear the distant grind of a plow truck or the bark of a farm dog, but the world felt held breath-tight, suspended in that strange glassy vacuum that follows a power surge. My headlights cut cones through the darkness, illuminating mailboxes that looked like gravestones and trees that seemed to lean in toward the road, their branches heavy with ice, looking too much like skeletal fingers grasping at the asphalt. When I reached the spot where the sidewalk ended and the road turned toward the Carson place, I saw the first thing that made my stomach turn over. It was a single red mitten, bright as a fresh wound against the blue-white snow. It was lying in the absolute center of the road, not off to the side where it might have been dropped, but placed there, deliberate as a marker. I stopped the cruiser and got out, my boots crunching loud enough to make me flinch. I didn't touch it. We didn't have the DNA tech back then that they have now, but I knew enough not to contaminate a scene. I shone my heavy maglite beam down the road, looking for the other one, looking for tracks. That was when the physics of the night stopped making sense. We had fresh powder, maybe 2 inches that had fallen in the last hour, perfect for holding a record of anyone who passed. I found Emily's footprints easily enough. They were small, distinct tread marks from those moon boots all the kids were wearing back then, walking along the shoulder of the road, heading toward home. I followed them for 50 yards, my breath pluming out in white clouds, my hand resting on the grip of my revolver without me even realizing I had put it there. The tracks were steady, rhythmic, the gait of someone walking with purpose. And then, right where the red mitten lay, they stopped. They didn't scuff like there had been a struggle. They didn't turn off into the woods. There were no tire tracks nearby, no other footprints, no sign of a second person. The trail simply terminated. It was as if gravity had reversed itself and pulled her straight up into the black sky. I stood there in the middle of the road, spinning in a slow circle, shining my light into the trees, into the ditch, up at the power lines that buzzed with an angry, insectoid rhythm overhead. There was nothing. Just the end of a walk that should have continued. By midnight, half the town was out there. That is the thing about 1984 in a place like Willow Point. We didn't wait for permission to help. The moment the word got out that a girl was missing, the pickup trucks started arriving, engines idling, exhaust pipes chugging gray smoke into the bitter air. Men I had known my whole life, men I played poker with and sat next to in the pew on Sundays, were pulling on heavy coats and loading fresh batteries into their flashlights. Among them was Tom Halloway, the high school shop teacher, a man built like a refrigerator with hands that could fix anything from a broken carburetor to a broken heart. I remember watching him organize a search grid near the tree line, his voice calm and commanding, reassuring the terrified parents. He put a heavy hand on Emily's father's shoulder, looking him in the eye with a solidity that seemed to anchor the panic in the room. "We'll find her, Bob," Tom said, and you could see the father physically lean into that promise, desperate to believe in the strength of a good neighbor. I watched Tom Halloway that night with nothing but gratitude. I watched him trudge through thigh-deep drifts, calling Emily's name until his voice was hoarse, leading the volunteers into the densest part of the woods where the brambles tore at their clothes. I didn't know then that I was watching a performance. I didn't know that the concern in his eyes was a mask painted over something so hollow and cold that it would have frozen the blood in my veins if I had glimpsed it. That is the psychological weapon the monsters use against us. They weaponize our trust. They hide behind the very virtues we admire: strength, reliability, helpfulness. Tom wasn't just part of the search. He was driving it, steering us away from the truth with the helpful enthusiasm of a saint. As the hours stretched toward dawn and the temperature bottomed out at 20 below, the atmosphere shifted from frantic to eerie. We were deep in the woods near the old creek bed when the radio started acting up again. It wasn't just static this time. It was a voice, buried under layers of white noise, rhythmic and repetitive. The deputies looked at each other, pale faces illuminated by the dancing beams of their flashlights. "Is that dispatch?" someone asked, voice shaking. It wasn't dispatch. It sounded like a child reciting numbers, or maybe a prayer, looping over and over. I grabbed my handset and keyed the mic, demanding clear air, but the sound just warped, stretching into a low metallic groan that seemed to vibrate in our teeth. And then, high above the tree line, we saw it again, that green flash, not like the aurora, but localized, a pulse of light that swept over the forest canopy like a searchlight from an invisible helicopter. The dogs went crazy then. We had the K9 unit from the county seat, 2 German shepherds that were trained to take down armed felons without flinching. But right then, they were whimpering, tails tucked, refusing to move forward into the clearing where the creek froze over. Their handler was cursing, yanking on the leashes. But those dogs were sensing something our dull human senses couldn't process. They were smelling fear or ozone, or something that didn't belong in the natural order of a Wisconsin winter. Tom Halloway walked up to me then, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the freezing cold. "Sheriff," he said, his voice low, "the guys are getting spooked. They're saying the woods feel ... wrong." I looked at him, this pillar of the community, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not fear, but excitement. A strange, dilated intensity that I dismissed as adrenaline. "Keep them moving, Tom," I said. "We don't stop until we find her." We didn't find her. Not that night, not the next day. The sun came up on a landscape that looked innocent and sparkling, mocking us with its beauty. The red mitten was tagged and bagged, the only physical proof that Emily Carson had existed at all in those final moments. The tracks that ended in nowhere were photographed until the flashbulbs burned out, but pictures couldn't explain the impossible. We had a town full of good people, a lockdown crime scene, and a mystery that defied the laws of physics. And all the while, the man who knew exactly where she was stood right next to me at the command post, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup, looking at the map, and suggesting we check the old quarry miles in the opposite direction of where the truth lay buried. The betrayal hadn't happened yet, not officially, but the hook was already set deep in our jaws. We were looking for a ghost, but we should have been looking at the man holding the flashlight. The betrayal didn't happen in a single moment. It was a slow poison that seeped into Willow Point over days that turned into weeks. While we were freezing our fingers off searching the wrong sectors, Tom Holloway was in the school gymnasium, comforting students. He organized the Lights On for Emily campaign, encouraging everyone to leave their porch lights burning all night, a gesture that felt like solidarity but was, in hindsight, a way to make the town feel watched, exposed. I remember sitting in his living room 3 weeks after Emily vanished. We were drinking whiskey that tasted like iodine, and he looked me dead in the eye and said, "You know, Sheriff, maybe she just ran away. Kids do that. The pressure gets to be too much." He said it with such gentle reason, such paternal sadness, that I found myself nodding. That's how good he was. He didn't just hide the body. He tried to erase the crime itself by rewriting the victim's character. But the town knew better. You can't fool a place where everyone knows everyone's business. The atmosphere in Willow Point changed. The unexplained phenomena didn't stop with Emily's disappearance. They escalated. People started reporting phone calls where no one spoke, just a wet, rhythmic breathing on the other end that sounded like someone trying to inhale through a mouthful of water. The power grid kept surging, blowing out transformers on clear nights. And then there were the birds. One morning in late January, I drove past the high school and saw the football field covered in black. Crows, thousands of them, standing silent in the snow, facing the woods where the search dogs had refused to go. They weren't pecking or moving. They were just waiting. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I parked and honked my horn, expecting them to scatter. They didn't flinch. They just turned their heads, thousands of black bead eyes fixing on me at once, judging me for my failure. That was the week I started having the dreams. I'm a practical man. I don't believe in psychics or messages from beyond. But every night, the moment I closed my eyes, I was in a basement I had never seen. It smelled of damp earth and that specific, metallic tang of ozone that you smell before a lightning strike. In the dream, I couldn't move my head, but I could hear a dripping sound, drip, 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 slow and heavy. And in the corner of my vision, just out of focus, sat a red mitten. I would wake up sweating, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't tell anyone, not even my wife. A sheriff who sees ghosts gets retired early. But I started driving around at night, aimless patrols that always seemed to circle back to the Holloway property. I told myself it was just routine, just thorough police work. Deep down, I knew my gut was screaming something my brain refused to process. February brought the thaw, a false spring that turned the roads to slush and the mood to gray despair. We had nothing. No body, no weapon, no witnesses. Just a missing girl and a town that was slowly turning on itself. Neighbors stopped talking. Accusations flew in hushed whispers at the grocery store. I saw the Jones boy near the woods, or the librarian has been acting strange. Fear makes people ugly. It strips away the veneer of civilization and leaves only the scared animal underneath. And through it all, Tom Holloway was the rock. He was the one calming the angry parents, the one organizing the community dinners. He was the perfect citizen. He even built a memorial bench for Emily in the town square, his hands sanding the wood with a care that looked like love. I watched him at the dedication ceremony, his head bowed in prayer, and for the first time, I saw it. Just a flash. A tiny, microscopic smirk when the pastor mentioned God's mysterious ways. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the mask of grief, but it hit me like a physical blow. He was enjoying this. He wasn't mourning. He was feeding. I went back to the station that night and pulled the file on the power outages. I laid them out on my desk, a map of blackouts and surges dating back 6 months. Then I overlaid the map of Emily's disappearance. Then the reports of the dead birds, the strange radio interference. It was a scattershot mess until I stopped looking at where things happened and started looking at where they didn't happen. There was a dead zone, a perfect circle of calm in the middle of the chaos. No power surges, no weird animal behavior, no reports of static. And right in the center of that eye of the storm sat a piece of property that had been in the Holloway family for 3 generations. An old farmhouse with a detached workshop and a storm cellar that wasn't on the county blueprints. I didn't have a warrant. I didn't have probable cause. I had a hunch fueled by sleepless nights and a smirk that might have been a trick of the light. But in 1984, in a town like Willow Point, the badge sometimes gave you a pass that the law didn't. I drove out to the Holloway place at 2 a.m. The house was dark, but the workshop had a faint, pulsing glow coming from the window, not yellow light, but that same sickly green I had seen on the horizon the night Emily vanished. I killed the engine and rolled the cruiser down the driveway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. I got out, drawing my service revolver, feeling the weight of it in my hand like an anchor. The air around the workshop was warmer than the surrounding night, buzzing with a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. I walked to the window and wiped the frost from the glass. What I saw inside didn't make sense. It wasn't a crime scene in the way I understood them. There was no blood, no weapon. Instead, the workshop was filled with electronics, old radios, televisions, ham radio equipment all gutted and rewired into a massive, chaotic web of copper and glass that centered on a single metal chair in the middle of the room. And sitting in that chair, strapped down with leather belts, was a doll, a life-size doll wearing a red mitten. Tom was standing over it, adjusting a dial on a console that looked like it had been scavenged from a dozen different appliances. He was talking to it, his voice soft and crooning, the way you talk to a frightened child. "Almost ready?" he whispered, his voice carrying through the thin glass. "Almost time to make the call." I kicked the door in. The explosion of noise was deafening, not a bang, but a shriek of feedback from every speaker in the room. Tom spun around, not with fear, but with annoyance, like I had interrupted a delicate experiment. "Sheriff," he said, "calm as you please. You're early." I had my gun leveled at his chest, my hands shaking. "Where is she, Tom?" I screamed. "Where is Emily?" He smiled then, that same thin, cold smile I had seen at the memorial. "She's everywhere, Sheriff," he said. "She's in the static. She's in the lights. I didn't just take her. I translated her." He reached for a lever on the console. I didn't wait. I fired. The bullet shattered a vacuum tube next to his head, sending a shower of sparks raining down. He flinched, pulling his hand back. "Don't be stupid," he hissed. "You don't understand what I've built here. This isn't murder. This is engineering." I cuffed him to a radiator and tore the place apart. I found the trapdoor under a rug in the corner. It led down to a root cellar that smelled of earth and ozone, the exact smell from my nightmare. But the cellar was empty. No body, no Emily, just a single lonely red mitten sitting on a wooden stool in the center of the room, and a wall covered in chalk equations that looked less like math and more like the ravings of a madman. We arrested him for kidnapping. We threw everything we had at him. But without a body, without a confession, the DI was nervous. Tom sat in the interrogation room, humming a tune that sounded disturbingly like the static from the radio, and refused to say a word. The town wanted blood. I wanted answers. But as the sun came up over a Wisconsin that felt permanently colder, I realized we had caught the monster, but we hadn't solved the mystery. Tom Holloway went to prison on circumstantial evidence Emily's hair in his trunk, the mitten in his cellar, but he never told us where she was. And for 40 years, that silence hung over Willow Point like a shroud, until last night. Until the phone rang and the snow started falling upward. I drove to the station in a daze, the windshield wipers slapping a frantic rhythm against the impossible snow. The young detective, a kid named Miller who wasn't even born when Emily disappeared, met me at the door. He looked shaken, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct. "You need to see this, Sheriff," he said, dispensing with the pleasantries. He led me not to the interrogation room, but to the evidence locker, a cold, sterile room that smelled of old cardboard and stale coffee. On the metal table in the center sat a cardboard box, the kind you use to store old tax returns. It was labeled Carson E-1984, recovered. My hands were trembling as I reached for the lid. "Where?" I asked, my voice rasping like dry leaves. "Where did you find her?" Miller swallowed hard. "We didn't find her exactly," he said. A construction crew was digging a foundation for a new condo complex out near the old Holloway property. They hit a buried septic tank, concrete, reinforced steel. It wasn't on any survey maps. He paused, looking at the box as if it might bite him. Inside the tank, they found a waterproof safe. And inside the safe was this. I opened the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of packing peanuts, was a cassette tape. An old TDK 90-minute cassette, the label yellowed and peeling. Written on it in black marker, in handwriting I recognized instantly as Tom Holloway's precise. Blocky script were 2 words, the translation. Beside the tape lay a notebook, a thick leather-bound journal filled with the same frantic equations I had seen on the cellar wall 40 years ago. And underneath that, a pristine red mitten, the mate to the one we found on the road. "We played the tape," Miller whispered. "Or ... we tried to." "What do you mean?" "It's not ... normal audio, Sheriff. We sent it to the state lab in Madison. They digitized it. They said the frequencies are ... wrong. They said there are sounds on there that shouldn't be capturable by magnetic tape. Sub-bass frequencies that cause nausea. High-pitched whines that made the lab tech's nose bleed." He hesitated. "But in the middle of it, there's a voice." I felt the room spin. "Emily? We think so. But she's not ... screaming. She's reading." "Reading what?" "Numbers, coordinates, and ... poetry. Weird stuff. Nursery rhymes, but backwards." Miller looked at me, his eyes wide and frightened. "And Sheriff, the date stamp on the digital file, the audio analysis. It says the recording was made yesterday." I stared at him. "That's impossible. Tom Holloway died in prison 10 years ago. Emily would be 56 years old." "I know," Miller said. "But the voice, it's a teenage girl." "The voice analysis matches the choir recordings we have of Emily from 1983. It's a perfect match. And the background noise. The lab guys say they hear a specific hum. 60-cycle hum, like a bad ground loop. But underneath that ... wind, and the sound of a bell. The bell. The church bell in Willow Point had a crack in it. It had a distinctive, flat tone that you could identify anywhere. It rang every hour on the hour. "Play it," I said. Miller led me to the AV room. He sat at a computer console, his hand hovering over the mouse. "Brace yourself," he said. He clicked play. At first, there was just static, thick, heavy white noise that sounded like a blizzard given a voice. Then, that low, throbbing hum I remembered from the night in the woods. It vibrated in my chest, making my heart skip a beat. And then, clear as a bell through the interference, a girl's voice. 3.7.9. The snow is warm here. The stars are loud. Mother, I can see the electricity. It tastes like copper. It was Emily. There was no mistaking it. But the cadence was wrong. It was flat, emotionless, like a recitation. Tom says I am the antenna. Tom says the signal needs a vessel. I am not cold anymore. The red mitten is the anchor. The red mitten holds the door. Then, a sound that made me grab the edge of the desk. The Willow Point church bell. Ong dot dot dot, ong dot dot. 2 strikes. 2 o'clock, I whispered. But when? Which day? I can see you, Sheriff, the voice on the tape said. I froze. The blood drained from my face. Miller gasped and pulled his headphones off. I can see the old man with the badge. You're looking at the box. You're holding the mitten. Don't put it on. If you put it on, the circuit closes. The tape dissolved into a shrieking, tearing noise that sounded like metal being ripped apart, and then silence. We sat in that room for a long time, neither of us speaking. The silence of the station felt heavy, charged. I looked at the box on the table. I looked at the red mitten, and I realized with a sick, sinking feeling that the arrest Miller had called me about wasn't of a person. It was of an object. They had arrested the past, dug it up, and brought it into the light, and now it was leaking. Who else has heard this? I asked. Just me, a lab tech, and you, Miller said. The tech ... He went home sick. Said he had a migraine that blinded him. Burn it, I said. Miller looked at me like I was crazy. What? This is evidence. This is the key to a 40-year-old murder. This isn't a murder, Miller, I said, standing up, my knees popping. Holloway told me. He said it wasn't murder. It was engineering. He didn't kill her. He put her somewhere else. Somewhere nearby. Somewhere ... adjacent. I walked over to the box and picked up the notebook. I flipped through the pages. Diagrams of radio waves, sketches of the human brain, and maps of Willow Point overlaid with strange geometric patterns. And on the last page, a date. November 28th, 2025. Today. The arrest shocks the community, I muttered, reading the headline in my mind. But not because we caught a killer. Because we found out the victim never left. What do we do? Miller asked, his voice small. We go to the church, I said. The bell on the tape. It rang twice. That's 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. It's 1:30 a.m. right now. You think. She's at the church? I think, I said, putting on my coat, that Tom Holloway built a machine to bridge a gap that shouldn't be bridged. I think he used Emily as the wire. And I think the battery in that safe just finished charging. We grabbed our gear. I took the red mitten. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could give it back to her. Maybe I thought it was a shield. Or maybe, just maybe, I was doing exactly what the voice on the tape told me not to do. Because 40 years of guilt makes you do stupid things in the hope of redemption. As we stepped out of the station, the snow was still falling upward. The streetlights were flickering in a rhythmic code dash, ... And high above the town, where the church steeple poked a hole in the dark sky, a green light began to pulse, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. Drive, I told Miller, and don't stop for anything. Not even if you see her standing in the road. The drive to the church was a study in the uncanny. Miller drove like a man possessed, the tires of the cruiser carving fresh ruts into snow that seemed to be accumulating from the ground up rather than falling from the sky. Willow Point was asleep or pretending to be, but the town felt different. The shadows stretched too long for the streetlights, cooling in doorways and alleys like spilled ink. And that sound, the low, throbbing hum I had first heard in Holloway's workshop, was everywhere now. It vibrated in the chassis of the car, in the fillings of my teeth. It was the sound of a high-tension wire pulled to its breaking point, singing just before it snaps. We skidded to a halt at the foot of the hill where the First Methodist Church stood. It was a postcard-perfect white clapboard building, built in 1902, with a steeple that rose sharp and accusatory against the bruised purple of the night sky. But tonight, it looked wrong. The green light pulsing from the belfry wasn't just a glow. It was solid, a gelatinous fog that seemed to be leaking from the louvers of the tower. And the birds were back. Thousands of them, perched on the roof, on the power lines, on the frozen branches of the oak trees in the cemetery next door. They were silent, facing the church, heads cocked as if listening to a sermon only they could hear. "Sheriff," Miller whispered, pointing. "Look at the clock." The church clock face, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, didn't say 1:45 a.m. The hands were spinning. Not fast, like in a cartoon, but with a nauseating, jerky rhythm. Forward 3 minutes, back 2, forward 5, back 10. It was trying to find a time that didn't exist. "Grab the bolt cutters from the trunk," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the strange, dampened air. "And bring the shotgun." Loaded with slugs, we walked up the stone steps, the snow crunching under our boots with a sound that was too loud, too wet. The heavy oak doors were locked, of course. I didn't bother with the key. I knew the pastor kept under the mat. I nodded to Miller. He stepped forward and snapped the padlock on the chain that had been looped through the handles. A new addition, I noted. Someone had tried to seal this place shut from the outside. The doors groaned open, revealing a sanctuary that should have been pitch black. Instead, it was filled with that same sickly green luminescence. It wasn't coming from any bulb. It was coming from the air itself, ionizing, charged with so much static electricity that the hair on my arms stood straight up. The pews were empty, but the air was thick with the smell of ozone and something else. Roses? Stale funeral home roses. The smell of preserved grief. "Upstairs," I said, pointing to the narrow door that led to the bell tower. The signal is coming from the bell. The stairs were narrow, wooden, and steep. With every step we climbed, the temperature dropped. By the time we reached the first landing, I could see my breath in thick gray clouds. Miller was shivering, his teeth chattering, but he kept his shotgun leveled at the darkness above. The hum was deafening here, a physical pressure that pushed against our eardrums. And then we heard it. Click. Whir. Click. The sound of a machine. Not a digital hum, but the mechanical grind of gears and servos. Old tech. 1980s tech. We burst onto the belfry platform, and the sight that met us stopped me cold. The bell, the massive iron bell that had tolled for every wedding and funeral in Willow Point for 80 years, was gone. In its place hung a chaotic sphere of copper wire, vacuum tubes, and spinning magnetic tape reels, all suspended from the rafters by heavy industrial chains. It looked like a tumor made of electronics, pulsing with that green light. And in the center of the sphere, suspended in a clear, cylindrical tank filled with bubbling, viscous liquid, was a red mitten. But it wasn't just a mitten. Wires ran into the fabric, hundreds of hair-thin filaments that glowed with blue light. And as the tape reels spun, the mitten moved. It flexed. It twitched. It was mimicking the movements of a hand that wasn't there. "It's a transmitter," Miller yelled over the hum. "Sheriff, look at the frequency dial. It's set to dot, dot, dot." He squinted at the old analog gauge. "It's not a radio frequency. It's bioelectric." Suddenly, the tape reels sped up. The hum pitched up into a shriek. The liquid in the tank began to boil. "Sheriff," the voice boomed, not from a speaker, but from the air itself, vibrating our very bones. "You brought the key." I looked down at my hand. I was still clutching the other red mitten. It was vibrating, warm to the touch, pulsing in sync with the machine above us. "Tom was a good engineer," Emily's voice said, devoid of any teenage inflection now, sounding ancient and cold. "But he couldn't finish the bridge." He needed 2 anchors, one here, one there. You kept the other one safe for 40 years. Thank you. This isn't Emily, Miller shouted, backing away. Sheriff, drop it. Drop the mitten. But I couldn't. My hand was locked around it. The muscles in my forearm were rigid, seized by a current that flowed from the wool straight into my nervous system. I felt a pull, not physical, but gravitational. The machine was dragging me toward the tank. I am not Emily, the voice agreed. I am the space where Emily used to be. I am the vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. The copper sphere began to spin. The green light intensified, blindingly bright. I saw the air in front of the tank ripple like heat off hot asphalt. And through that ripple, I saw a road, a snowy road in Willow Point, lit by starlight. I saw a young girl walking. I saw her stop. I saw her look up at the sky, her face twisted in terror. And I saw a shadow descend, not a man, but a tear in the world, a hole that looked like a mouth. It wasn't Holloway. I screamed, the realization hitting me harder than the electricity. He didn't take her. He was trying to catch her. He was trying to pull her back. He was trying to close the door, the voice corrected. But he failed. And now you are going to open it wide. The pull became irresistible. I was sliding across the floorboards, my boots scrabbling for purchase. Miller raised the shotgun. Sheriff, get down. Don't shoot the tank, I roared. If you break the seal, ... I'm not aiming at the tank, Miller yelled. He aimed at the chains holding the sphere. Boom. The shotgun blast was thunder in the small space. The chain snapped. The massive copper sphere plummeted, crashing through the rotted floorboards of the belfry, smashing through the ceiling of the sanctuary below. The connection broke. The current in my arm died instantly. I fell back against the wall, gasping for air. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. We scrambled to the edge of the hole and looked down. The machine lay in a ruined heap on the altar, sparking and smoking. The tank had shattered. The liquid was pooling on the carpet, sizzling. And lying in the middle of the wreckage were 2 red mittens. Both of them. Is it over? Miller wheezed, wiping blood from his nose. I looked at the mittens. They weren't moving. The green light was fading. The hum was gone. I don't know, I said, my voice trembling. I think we just hung up the phone. But as we made our way down the stairs, leaving the wreckage of the past behind us, I couldn't shake the image I had seen in the ripple. The girl on the road. She hadn't been looking at a spaceship. She hadn't been looking at a monster. She had been looking at us. She had been looking through the tear in time, 40 years into the future, at 2 terrified men in a bell tower. And she had waved. We walked out of the church into the cold dawn. The snow had stopped. The birds were gone. The clock on the tower was still, frozen at 2:14 a.m. Miller got into the driver's seat, his hands shaking so bad he could barely turn the key. What do we put in the report? He asked. Gas leak, I said, staring out the window. Explosion. Vandalism. The usual. And the body? He asked. We still don't have a body. I reached into my pocket. My hand brushed against something soft. Wool. I froze. I pulled it out. It was a blue mitten. Small. Knitted. Miller, I said, my blood turning to ice. Emily Carson was wearing red mittens. Yeah, he said, putting the car in gear. So? This one is blue, I whispered. And it's warm. Miller slammed on the brakes. We both stared at the blue mitten in my hand. Who ... doubled, Miller started, but his voice failed. The radio in the cruiser crackled to life. Not static this time. A clear, chirpy voice. The morning DJ from the local station. Good morning, Willow Point. It's a beautiful Friday, November 28th, 1984. Temperature is a chilly 10 degrees, ... I looked at Miller. He looked at me. We looked out the window. The cars parked on the street were different. Boxy sedans. Station wagons with wood paneling. No SUVs. The sign on the gas station across the street said gas, $1.10. We hadn't stopped the machine. We hadn't hung up the phone. We had fallen through the receiver. And somewhere in this town, a teenage girl named Emily Carson was waking up, getting ready for school, unaware that she had only 12 hours left to exist. "Miller," I said, cocking my service weapon, "we have work to do. The arrest didn't shock the community. The arrest never happened, because the crime hasn't been committed yet. But this time the sheriff knows where the trapdoor is." Most people think time is a river, flowing in one direction, carrying us all inevitably toward the waterfall. But after what I saw in that bell tower, I know better. Time isn't a river. It's a radio signal. And just like any signal, it can be jammed, looped, or if you have enough power and enough madness broadcast over. The red mittens weren't just knitwear. They were grounding wires. Tom Halloway hadn't built a time machine. He had built a repeater station, and Emily was the message he was trying to send back to himself. We spent the morning of November 28, 2025, or was it 1984, driving through a town that felt like a memory preserved in amber. Miller was white-knuckled on the wheel, his eyes darting to the gas prices, the fashion in the shop windows, the lack of cell towers on the horizon. "Sheriff," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My dad, he's alive here. He's working at the mill. If I go see him, if I tell him—" "You don't tell him anything," I snapped, though my own heart was hammering at the thought of seeing my wife, young again, before the cancer, before the long silence of our later years. "We are contaminants, Miller, walking paradoxes. If we touch anything, if we change anything, we might erase the very reason we're here. We have one job: find Emily Carson before 2:14 p.m. That was the deadline. The bell tower clock had been frozen at 2:14. The recording had 2 strikes. Halloway's notes said the translation required a precise alignment of energy. 2:14 p.m. was when school let out early for the Thanksgiving break in '84. It was when Emily started walking home. We ditched the cruiser in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. A 2024 Ford Explorer with LED light bars would raise too many questions. We walked into town, collars turned up, keeping our heads down. It was colder here. The air tasted cleaner, sharper, smelling of wood smoke and diesel that hadn't been scrubbed by catalytic converters. And underneath it all, that hum. It was fainter now, without the machine in the tower to amplify it, but it was there. A low, persistent vibration that seemed to be coming from the ground itself. We found her at the diner. It's a strange thing to see a ghost eating cherry pie. Emily Carson was sitting in a booth near the window, laughing with 2 other girls. She looked so painfully young. Her hair was feathered in that style that everyone made fun of later but looked perfect then. She was wearing a bulky sweater, and the red mittens, they were sitting on the table next to her milkshake. Miller grabbed my arm. "There she is. We just ... grab her? Put her in a safe house until the time passes? And then what?" I hissed. "We're stuck here? She's stuck with us? Think, Miller. Halloway's here too. The 1984 version of him. And he's already built the machine. He's waiting for her. So we stop him. We can't just arrest him," I said. "He hasn't done it yet. We have no jurisdiction in the past." "To hell with jurisdiction," Miller said, his voice rising. "We have the future. We know what he does." The bell on the diner door jingled. A man walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy canvas coat and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He waved at the waitress, clapped a man on the back, and walked straight to Emily's booth. It was Tom Halloway, young, vital, terrifying. Emily, he said, his voice smooth as oil. Your dad called the shop. Said his truck wouldn't start. Asked if I could give you a ride home after you're done here. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. Bob Carson's truck never broke down. He treated that Ford better than he treated his own niece. But Emily didn't know that. She smiled, that bright, trusting smile that breaks your heart when you see it on a missing poster. Sure, Mr. Holloway, she said. Thanks. She reached for the mittens. No, I shouted. The diner went silent. Every head turned. Emily froze, her hand halfway to the red wool. Tom Holloway turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. For a second, there was confusion. And then recognition. Not of my face, I was an old man now, not the young sheriff he knew, but of the energy. He felt the hum coming off me. He saw the blue mitten sticking out of my pocket. His smile widened. It wasn't friendly. Well, he said, looks like the cavalry arrived late. Or is it early? He grabbed Emily's arm. We're leaving. Run, Emily. Miller screamed, drawing his weapon. Panic erupted. The waitress dropped a tray of dishes. Customers scrambled under tables. But Holloway didn't pull a gun. He pulled a remote control from his pocket, a clunky, gray box with a single red button. You broke the receiver, he shouted at us, backing toward the door, dragging a struggling Emily with him. But the transmitter is still perfectly fine. He pressed the button. The world lurched. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a frequency shift. The colors in the diner washed out, turning sepia, then gray, then inverted. The sound of screaming customers slowed down to a deep, demonic groan. Gravity seemed to tilt sideways. I fell against the counter, clutching my chest. The blue mitten in my pocket was burning hot. He's shifting the local field, I yelled to Miller. He's taking her to the workshop. He's not driving there. He's folding space. Holloway and Emily were already at the door, but the door wasn't opening onto the street anymore. It was opening onto a void of swirling green static. Help me. Emily screamed, her voice distorting, echoing as if she were falling down a well. Miller didn't hesitate. He charged. He didn't fire his gun. He just threw himself at them, tackling Holloway into the static. Miller? I shouted, and then they were gone. The door slammed shut. The colors snapped back to normal. The sound returned to real time. I was standing in a diner in 1984, surrounded by terrified people, holding a burning blue mitten, and my partner had just jumped into a wormhole with a serial killer and his victim. I ran to the door and kicked it open. Outside, it wasn't the street. It wasn't the static. It was the woods. The deep, dark woods where we had searched for her. But it wasn't winter. The trees were full of leaves. The air was hot and humid. Cicadas were buzzing. I looked at my watch. The date window didn't say 1984. It didn't say 2025. It spun wildly. I had followed them, but I hadn't landed in the same place, or the same time. I was standing in the exact spot where the footprints had stopped, and lying on the ground in front of me, pristine and untouched, was a single red mitten. But this time, there was a hand inside it, and the hand was pointing, not at me, at the sky. I looked up. The sky wasn't blue. It wasn't black. It was a ceiling. A massive industrial ceiling covered in catwalks and lights. We weren't outside. We were never outside. Willow Point. The whole town ... was a set, a containment zone, a petri dish. And looking down from the catwalk, 40 stories up, were faces. Giant, impassive faces behind glass. Tom Holloway hadn't built a time machine. He had built an elevator. He had figured out how to escape the experiment. And he had taken Emily with him to the control room. I gripped the blue mitten. The hum was gone. In its place was a voice over a PA system, echoing from the sky. Subject 84C has breached containment. Initiate purge sequence. I started running. Not toward the town, toward the wall. Because if this was a cage, I was going to break the bars. They say adrenaline masks pain, but it doesn't mask the impossible. I ran through the woods, or rather, the set of the woods, my lungs burning with air that was too clean, too perfectly regulated. Above me, the catwalks hummed with activity. I could see figures in white lab coats pointing down at me, their voices muffled by the thick glass of the observation deck. I wasn't a sheriff anymore. I was a lab rat that had chewed through its cage, and now the scientists were scrambling for the poison. I made it to the edge of the forest, where the trees simply stopped, replaced by a smooth matte gray wall that stretched up into the artificial gloom. I ran my hand along it. It was cold, vibrating slightly. This was the boundary of Willow Point, the boundary of my entire life. Every sunset I had watched from my porch, every snowstorm, every crime I had solved, it had all happened inside this box. The realization should have broken me. Instead, it sharpened me into a weapon of pure rage. Think, I growled to myself, my breath fogging on the cold wall. Holloway built an elevator. Where? I remembered the map in the notebook Miller had found. The dead zone? The eye of the storm. It wasn't just a place where the power didn't surge. It was the access point. The service hatch. I turned and sprinted back toward the Holloway property. The sun was beginning to set, a mechanical dimming of the overhead lights that turned the sky a bruised purple. It was 2:14 p.m. in the simulation, the time of the abduction, the time of the translation. When I reached the farmhouse, it was gone. In its place stood a massive industrial airlock door set into the side of a fake hill. It was open, and inside, the green light was pulsing. I didn't stop. I ran into the light. The room beyond wasn't the workshop I remembered. It was a loading dock. And there, standing on a metal platform suspended over a deep black chasm, was Tom Holloway. He was holding Emily by the arm. She was limp, unconscious, her red mittens dangling from her wrists. Miller was there too. He was on his knees, blood pouring from a cut on his forehead, a security guard with a futuristic rifle standing over him. "Sheriff," Miller choked out, "it's not time travel. It's a reality show. It's a history preserve." Holloway turned to look at me. He looked older now. The young mask was slipping. Or maybe the stress of the breach was aging him rapidly. "Sheriff," he said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber, "you're persistent. I'll give you that. Most of the units just accept the programming. They see a glitch. They call it a ghost. You had to go and poke the wall. Let her go, Tom," I said, raising my gun. "Or whoever you are." "I'm the curator," he said, smiling. "And Emily isn't a person. She's a focal point, a narrative anchor. Do you know how expensive it is to simulate 1984 with this level of fidelity? The nostalgia market is huge in 2140. People pay millions to watch authentic tragedies unfold in real time. But the story needs an ending. The disappearance of Emily Carson is the season finale. It has to happen. If she doesn't vanish, the ratings tank. The funding gets cut. And this whole town, your wife, your memories, it all gets erased." He took a step toward the edge of the platform. Below him, the chasm swirled with green mist, the reclamation chute, where props were disposed of. "You're telling me my life is a TV show?" I asked, stepping closer. The blue mitten in my pocket was vibrating again. "Hard. Not a show," Holloway sneered. "An exhibit. The late 20th century. A study in fear. And you're ruining the climax." He shoved Emily toward the edge. "No." I didn't shoot Holloway. I shot the control panel next to the door. Sparks. The blast blew out the lighting rig. The sun overhead flickered and died. The entire simulation plunged into darkness. "You idiot!" Holloway screamed. "You cut the power to the dampeners." That was what I was counting on, because in the notebook, on the page about the translation, it said the machine needed a vacuum. It needed a break in the signal. In the darkness, the blue mitten in my pocket flared with light. It wasn't just warm now, it was blinding. A beam of pure blue energy shot out of it, cutting through the dark like a laser. And from the unconscious girl on the platform, the red mittens answered. Zap! A red beam shot up from Emily's hands. The two beams met in the middle of the room, right over Holloway's head. The sound was like a jet engine taking off inside a library. The air tore open, but it wasn't a hole in space this time. It was a hole in the simulation. Through the tear, I saw a room, a messy, cluttered bedroom with posters of Duran Duran on the wall. I saw a window looking out on a real messy, chaotic street with ugly modern cars. I saw a calendar that said November 1984, real 1984. The anchor, I yelled to Miller. The mittens are the anchor. They're pulling her home. Holloway saw it too. He lunged for Emily, trying to drag her back from the beam. She belongs to the museum, he roared. I didn't run this time. I just threw the blue mitten. It sailed through the air, a glowing comet of wool and hope. Holloway tried to catch it. He thought it was a weapon. He caught it. The moment his hand touched the blue wool while he was holding Emily's arm, connected to the red wool, the circuit closed. But Holloway wasn't the anchor. He was the interference. The energy backlash didn't translate him. It erased him. He didn't scream. He just unspooled, like a cassette tape pulled apart by a furious child. He turned into ribbons of static, then into code, then into nothing. The blast knocked me off my feet. I hit the metal grating hard. When I looked up, the tear was closing. Emily was standing up. She looked confused. She looked at the red beam coming from her hands. She looked at the closing hole. "Go!" I shouted. "Emily, jump! Jump for the room!" She looked at me. She looked at Miller. She looked at the fake world crumbling around her. "Who are you?" she whispered. "We're the bad dream," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Wake up!" She jumped. She dove into the beam of light just as the tears sealed shut with a sound like a thunderclap. The lights came back on. The emergency klaxons were blaring. The platform was empty. Holloway was gone. Emily was gone. Miller crawled over to me. He looked at the empty space where the girl had been. "Did she make it?" he asked. "Did she make it to the real 1984? I reached into my pocket. It was empty. The blue mitten was gone. It had gone with her. "I don't know," I said, struggling to stand as the security guards burst through the door. "But if she did, then the story changed. And what happens to us?" Miller asked, looking at the guards raising their weapons. I smiled. For the first time in 40 years, I felt truly light. "We get canceled," I said. And then the world went white. I woke up in a hospital bed. Not a sleek, futuristic pod, and not a dark, damp dungeon. A regular hospital bed with scratchy sheets and a smell of antiseptic that stung my nose. A nurse was adjusting the blinds, letting in a stream of weak, gray light. "He's awake," she said softly. Miller was sitting in the chair next to the bed. He looked older. His hair was thinner, gray at the temples. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, not a uniform. He was holding a styrofoam cup of coffee, staring at me with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "How long?" I croaked. My throat felt like I had swallowed a handful of gravel. "You've been in a coma for 3 days, Sheriff," Miller said. "Stroke. They found you in your living room on Friday night." "The church," I whispered. "The tower." "Holloway." Miller shook his head slowly. "Sheriff." Tom Holloway died in prison 10 years ago. The church tower was condemned in '99. There was no machine, no elevator, no museum. I sat up, ignoring the protest of the monitors. Don't lie to me, Miller. I was there. You were there. The blue mitten. The red beam. Miller leaned forward, his voice low. I wasn't there, Sheriff. I was at home with my wife. You called me at 2 a.m., raving about a cold case, about Emily Carson. You said you were going to solve it. Then the line went dead. I fell back onto the pillows. A stroke, a hallucination. An old man's brain firing its last, desperate synapses to make sense of a tragedy he couldn't fix. It made sense. It was rational. It was exactly what a doctor would say. But Emily, I said, we found her. She went back. Emily Carson is still missing, Sheriff, Miller said gently. She's been missing for 41 years. There's no body, no closure, just a cold case. He stood up and patted my arm. Get some rest. The doctor says you'll be okay. Just ... Take it easy on the old war stories, all right? He left the room. I lay there, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the dots. It was over. Just a dream. A vivid, terrifying, wonderful dream where I finally got to be the hero. I closed my eyes, ready to drift back into the sleep of the medicated. And then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was tapping on the window. I opened my eyes. We were on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony. I turned my head. Standing on the windowsill, looking in through the glass, was a bird, a blue jay. It was hopping back and forth, agitated, and tied to its leg was a piece of red yarn. I pulled the 4 out of my arm. I didn't care about the blood. I swung my legs out of bed and stumbled to the window. I unlatched it and pushed it open. The cold air hit me like a slap. The bird flew off, a streak of blue against the gray sky. But on the sill, where it had been standing, was a small folded piece of paper. Old paper. Yellowed, brittle notebook paper. My hands were shaking so hard, I almost dropped it. I unfolded it. It was a drawing. A child's drawing, done in crayon. Stick figures. 2 men in uniforms. One old, one young. Standing in a tower. And below them, a girl with red mittens. And written in the corner, in a bubbly teenage script that I hadn't seen in 4 decades, was a note. They said it was a dream, too. They said I hit my head on the ice. They said I was found wandering on the road, confused but fine. I grew up. I got married. I have grandkids now. But I never forgot the blue light. And I never forgot the man who threw the anchor. Thank you for the mitten. It was warm. Emily, 2025. I looked out the window. Down in the parking lot below, an old woman was getting into a car. She had silver hair and a heavy coat. She stopped before she opened the door. She looked up. Up at the 3rd floor. Up at me. She raised a hand. She was wearing red mittens. She waved. I waved back. And then, for the first time in 40 years, the hum stopped. The static in my head cleared. The weight on my chest vanished. I turned back to the empty room. Miller was right. To the world, nothing had changed. The files would still say, missing. The history books would still list Holloway as a killer. But the universe knows. The math knows. I walked back to the bed and sat down. I picked up the piece of paper and folded it carefully, tucking it into the pocket of my hospital gown. Let them call it a stroke. Let them call it madness. I know the truth. We didn't just solve the case. We beat the time.